Hi, class. Excuse me. This is Dr. Bourne, and talking with you today about Notre Dame football and some of the things that led to the explosion of Notre Dame football as being representative of Catholic identity in the United States. And so this conflation between religion and sports is embodied in the popularity of Notre Dame football across the country. So with that, I'm going to jump right in to some discussion, just a little bit of backtrack. And so we're coming out of the early 1900s, where in the South, you have the notion of, college football kind of got a slow start in the late 1800s and early 1900s because the South thought it was just a brutal sport, violent, and the fans around it. And plus, it was getting popular in the Northeast, and anything popular in the Northeast was going to hit with resistance in the South with this leftover this leftover tension after the Civil War. So you still have that going on with the leftover tension of the Civil War, and so they were not embracing this liberal theology. They were not embracing any of the sports coming out of the Northeast. But that began to change after World War I, and people saw the real violence in World War I, and they saw football as preparation for the athletes for preparing for war, and they saw it as a patriotic event of people coming back from war in a way to kind of, instead of fighting North versus South with World War I, it brought the country together and allowed a little bit more influence of the Northeast into the South. So you have those couple of things, and then finally what you had in the South, and really sort of the huge catalyst that pushed everything in the direction of the South embracing this full 180 was when Alabama won the Rose Bowl and went to Washington and beat Washington in a stunning upset. And when they came back to Alabama, this is when the South really kind of picked it up in the 1920s, or so. Really picked up this notion of football. So we're going to turn now to looking at Notre Dame football around that same era, around that early 1900s, 1918 or so, 1920s through the death of Rockne, and we'll see, looking at Notre Dame football even today. So before that, going back, we have to have an understanding of Catholicism in the United States during this time. So before the understanding of the importance of Notre Dame football in American culture, specifically American Catholic culture, we have to understand the role of Catholics in the United States at this time. Okay, so even today, there's an article that was written by Philip Jenkins, wrote a book about this new anti-Catholicism, and there's another article saying that anti-Catholicism is the last acceptable prejudice that you could have in the United States. And this anti-Catholicism goes back a long way. The Puritans came over and they thought that the Puritanic religion was the correct religion, the only religion. And even when, in 1642, Catholics were not allowed to settle in Virginia. In 1778, the Constitution of South Carolina said no person shall be eligible to sit in the House of Representatives unless he be of the Protestant religion. And there were no she's in the House of Representatives. They weren't allowed. And so he would have to be of the Protestant religion. And in 1787, a couple years later, the US Constitution removed any religious test. And the last religious test was ended in 1810. Still, even in the 1840s, you have the Know Nothing or Nativist movement. And this was a response to the growing Catholic immigration from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and other Western European countries, and some Eastern Poland as well. And there's this claim that they were destroying the United States culture. And they were coming primarily in the Northeast. And so you have Boston, which is a Catholic hotbed. Some of the German Catholics would arrive in New York and pass through and go to some of the Midwestern cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cincinnati is a very large Catholic city. But they came here as immigrants. They didn't have jobs. Many of them didn't speak the language. And so you had this really strong anti-Catholic sentiment across the entire United States. And it took a while for them. And I'll talk a little bit about how did they get plugged into culture and how did they rise? Because now you don't think about it. You don't think of an anti-Catholic bias. And now we have a president-elect who is Catholic. John F. Kennedy was Catholic. What you have in 1875, Grant had prohibited the creation of sectarian schools because public education was made available to all. So in 1875, this education, and I've talked about this in the past, how you have Catholics develop the parallel institutions. So, but in 1875 said, okay, there's no sectarian schools, but the education, the quote unquote public education was distinctly Protestant. People learned how to read by reading the Bible. It was taught in class. The religions were taught in class. And so there was no real outlay or no real avenue for Catholics because they were sending their kids to the public schools. And so they were not allowed to create their own private schools yet. So in 1920s, you have, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, the KKK attacked Catholics and the church, noting that it was fundamentally opposed to democracy. Because the argument against Catholics was that they followed the Pope as a political leader as well as a theological leader or a spiritual leader. And so many people attack Catholics without understanding a lot of the traditions and the infallibility of the Pope and a lot of these teachings without understanding, saying, well, Catholics, they just follow the Pope. And so even when John F. Kennedy was elected president, or when he was running for president, he had to give a speech in Houston, I think it was, talking about his Catholic faith and really trying to delineate like this distinction between following one's faith and following one's conscience and following the laws of the land, and really making that distinction. And he obviously successfully did that because he was elected president. So Al Smith was a Democratic presidential candidate in 1928, governor of New York 4 times, but a lot of his opponents completely undermined his candidacy, saying like he's running as the face of the Pope. And so that the Pope was going to take over the United States through Al Smith. So if your history books are correct, Al Smith is not one of our presidents. So that line of thinking was successful. So in response to the prevalence of Protestant theology in the public schools, Catholics began to organize parallel institutions. So they won a Supreme Court battle in 1925, but they couldn't use any public funds. And so in 1925, the Supreme Court said, sure, go ahead. You want to educate your own kids? Sure, by all means. Now you did have, before that time, you had a lot of Catholic universities that were founded. And again, a lot of these Catholic universities were founded by certain religious houses, by certain religious groups. For example, the Jesuits, they would found their Catholic priestly organization. And so you have different strands of Catholicism. You have the LaSalle brothers, you have the Marianists, you have in Providence, you have the Dominicans. You have a wide variety of different different approaches to Catholicism. And so it's all Catholicism, but different focus on different things. For example, the Jesuits focus on social justice and education. The Dominicans are more about orthodoxy and belief. Sometimes you have the Franciscans. The Franciscans are more about peace and education and loving animals with St. Francis. But you have different charisms of the different traditions within Catholicism. And so, but they started different universities across the country, but they were not allowed to have elementary school or high schools until 1925. So when they did that, no public funds could be used. And so they had to fund it themselves. But what you have is a whole sort of Catholic culture emerging in the 1920s as well as what's going on at Notre Dame with their football in the 1920s. So you have this, Catholics are going to now be around, they're not going to be integrated into society yet. Okay, so they're going to their own schools, their universities, their own hospitals. A lot of the hospitals are Catholic, and then a lot of the hospitals still are. At least they were originally Catholic. So you do have a parallel institution where Catholics are a little bit more isolated, which allows them, one, to be persecuted, but it also allows them to find solidarity with other Catholics. So now we get to Notre Dame. So when Notre Dame began to gain prominence in the early 1900s, Catholics everywhere aligned their support with the school. Okay, so it was the prominent Catholic universities. So there's really only two prominent Division I Catholic universities that play football: Boston College and Notre Dame. So a lot of the other Catholic universities, Georgetown, Santa Clara, Villanova, they have the in the bowl subdivision, or they're not in the bowl subdivision. They're in the playoff subdivision, but they're Division I, but they're not in the bowl subdivision. So yes, you have a whole lot of. I think those are the only two Catholic schools that have. Even Loyola. I don't think Loyola So in New Orleans, I don't think they have a Division I. So very, very few, especially at this time, have football teams. You did have some schools back then have football teams as well, but they were pretty bad. So Loyola in Chicago had a football team, and Georgetown had a football team, but they were both terrible. And so they weren't a team that could galvanize all Catholics across the country to kind of pull them together. And so I note earlier, or in the text, it talks about how the KKK, ironically, helped bring Notre Dame culture to the forefront. So, and players were emerging prominence in Notre Dame football across American culture. How does that happen? Okay, so if we look at the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So what they're doing. So we're in this section right here. So actually, just this section. Okay. So Ku Klux Klan. So they are rallying against. They're rallying for white supremacy and the prominence of white culture and white Western Christian culture, Protestant Christian culture. Okay. And so when you have immigrants coming into the United States, okay, they're rallying against any immigrants, and these immigrants tended to be Catholic or Jewish. Okay, they're rallying against African Americans. Okay, so the three major groups that they consider to be harming the United States are Catholics, Jews, and African Americans. Okay. So where do we have Notre Dame? So Notre Dame is in northern Indiana. We don't have a whole lot of Jewish people up in northern Indiana. Okay. And the book talks about the prevalence of the KKK in Indiana during this time. And I think it said, what did it say? It said something along the lines of like nearly one third of the population in central and northern Indiana, the area surrounding South Bend, belonged to the KKK. So 1/3 of the population around Notre Dame belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, and the Catholics, Jews, and African Americans bore the brunt of their attacks. You don't have a whole lot of Jews around that area, okay? And also during that time, African Americans tended to be more segregated in Gary, Indiana, and on the south side of Chicago, and not around South Bend. So when you have people in the Ku Klux Klan, and 1/3 of the population, so when they're going to rise up, okay, then what they were going to rise up against, they're rising up against the Catholics. Okay, and so if we think about this in terms of like, okay, what does external pressure? External pressure equals internal cohesion. It's a sociological maxim. So, okay, external. Okay, if I can type. Okay, so this is a sociological maxim, and so when a group is being attacked, it pulls that group together, and so cohered Catholics together, not only in northern Indiana around Notre Dame, but it also Catholics across the entire country began to identify with the persecution that the Catholics in Indiana were receiving from the KKK. So what happened was like it brought Notre Dame to the forefront of American culture, and Catholics, now their football team was good as well, but the Catholics were then identifying with them saying, yes, we support them because we are Catholic. That is our institution. That is a Catholic institution, and that's going to be representative. So that's of the entire country. So that's how you start getting a more nationalization of Notre Dame's fan base, as opposed to just a localization of Notre Dame's fan base. And there's also the immigrant population, Catholic population of Chicago. Okay, that's a huge thing as well, because you do have a lot of immigrants coming in. Again, these are immigrants from Italy, from Germany, from Poland, from Ireland, and they're all coming in together. And so they have their little segments within Chicago. And if you walk around Chicago, what we call them Catholic ghettos. Is you have your Irish ghetto, you have your Italian ghetto. You still have these, okay, but they're waning as you have a lot more of migration and moving cross migration. But what it does is it gives these groups, these immigrant groups, something more common where it brings the Irish Catholics, the Italian Catholics, the German Catholics together, the Polish Catholics together for a common purpose in Chicago. Chicago being only 45 minutes, 50 minutes from South Bend, Indiana. And so there's a huge population there. So Notre Dame was able to tap into that. And plus a lot of Catholics from Chicago sent their students. It was a men's university back then. They sent their students to Notre Dame. So because it was much more local in that regard. Okay, so a next thing that helped with Notre Dame becoming this more nationalized entity, pooling people together around everything. So you didn't have, if we think about the time frame, okay, and looking at 1919 or 1920, around this time. So the sports link to Chicago and the lack of professional successful teams in the town contributed greatly to the growing fan base of Notre Dame fans in Chicago. So if we think about what happened in 1919, okay, coming off the 1918 flu pandemic, so that's one, it's like just like we're in a pandemic now. The last great pandemic was 1918, and so you had decimation and you had serious, say like depression, but you had a terrible time going on, and Chicago was hit hard by that. Then you also had the 1919 Black Sox scandal, where the Chicago Black Sox or the Chicago White Sox baseball team, they were accused and convicted of throwing the World Series. Shoeless Joe Jackson and many of the teammates were banned. The Reds, the Cincinnati Reds, ended up being the winner, but in my opinion, I think the Reds would have won anyway, even if. And Shoeless Joe Jackson said, "We didn't throw it. Look at our stats." But anyway, the Black Sox scandal certainly it knocked out. People were no longer fans of that team. So the local colleges, as the tech notes were terrible. Loyola had a team. So someone else had a team. DePaul had a team. Both teams were pretty bad in Chicago, and so there were no local teams there. The professional team, again, the baseball team, and you didn't have professional football there yet. So some of the other teams, and so the only really successful team was this Notre Dame. Okay, Notre Dame, and plus, when Notre Dame was building a new stadium, they played in Chicago, Soldier Field, and sold their games out. Largest crowd ever at the time for a college game at Soldier Field was 120,000. They also played Northwestern every year. Actually, one year they played at Northwestern for all their games, and so that was a big rivalry game too. Northwestern, which is in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. But so they were able to tap into that market, that Chicago market, and then also going into this number 4 here, Newt Rockne, the Gipper, and the press. So Newt Rockne was this up-and-coming coach, brilliant tactical coach. It's right around the beginning of the forward pass, that innovation in football. He was able to adopt and embrace that innovation and really be successful with that. And also what he was able to do is his press assistants, his press assistants were the only people that could produce articles, and anything written about Notre Dame had to filter through his press office. Okay? And then through his connections, his press assistants went on to powerful roles as sports editors of the Chicago Tribune and eventually the New York Times. And so he was able to tap into this market and provide a direct connection of these sports editors had to have access to him. And in turn, they would write positive stories about Notre Dame. I mean, it wasn't a quid pro quo necessarily. But it was understood. I mean, if they wanted to have access, they couldn't just be ripping the team. And so you had positive press coverage, and the fact that you had press coverage of Notre Dame in the Chicago Tribune and even all the way in the New York Times. The Indianapolis Star was another paper. And so because he was able to groom these press these press assistants that worked in the athletic department. And as they went out, they still kept that connection, and he provided access to them, to the team, especially when they went on the road, when Notre Dame went to West Point in New York and was able to connect with people, with the editor of the New York Times. They had direct access. So that really, really helped nationalize the fan base. If they're writing about Notre Dame all the time in this, we didn't have a lot of TV, had some radio, but newspapers were the prime way people communicated. And so if they're getting positive press coverage, then that's going to create a sense of identity and certainly a larger fan base across the country. Father O'Hara was the president of Notre Dame during this time, during Rockne's tenure. And he really thought that football is a way to evangelize. Football is a way to evangelize Catholicism. It taught great Catholic and civic virtues, discipline, courage, initiative, generosity, frankness, alertness, etc. And football at Notre Dame can stimulate faith. So like outside of church, the best thing we got is good, clean football. I mean, he was passionate about this, that it was a way to help people overcome the anti-Catholic bias and to spread the faith. And the football players as well set examples for others to follow. There is mandatory mass attendance, and that led other people to do the same. There are stories in the chapter about young kids asking their parents if they can make sure, can you make sure that we go to mass and receive the communion? Because the Notre Dame football players are doing that too, and there's pictures of them doing it. There's a famous one of like when they're in New York to play West Point, they find their way to the cathedral, they go to mass there. I think it was St. Patrick's, and they see a lot of pictures, and it showed that there is that faith was explicitly connected with Notre Dame football. And two rituals, so President O'Hara and Rockne, they initiated two rituals as well that are still going on to this day. So that was in the Kahoot. But the first one is they publicized these ceremonious communion services on the eve prior to the games. And these were so important that even Newt Rockne cited them as one of the reasons he converted to Catholicism during his tenure as coach. And then there's also the Joan of Arc medals. So you can see on page 140 that O'Hara replied that if Elise Jenkins kicked off for Army, Joan of Arc would kick off for Notre Dame. He proceeded to give each member of the team a Joan of Arc medal, suitably blessed, to wear on a chain around the neck during the game. For the next 10 years, O'Hara regularly distributed Saints medals before ball games. His successors have continued the practice right up to the present. Okay? And so, I mean, these things are an explicit connection between religion and the promotion of Notre Dame football. So, what also happened? I mean, the team was incredibly successful. It was they're winning a lot. They're winning national championships, and one of the reasons for that was for the Gipper, George Gipp. So, but there's a tragic story behind this, and so the death of George Gipper and the death of Newt Rockne sent shockwaves across the American Catholic community. And so again, this advertisement and this nationalized story about Notre Dame football really kept Notre Dame at this prominent level. And so they helped establish the cult of the fallen athlete. So if we're talking about this, the story behind George Gipp, the death of George of the Gipper. So George of the Gipper was his senior year. He was an All-American, and he was best player on the team. And he contracted pneumonia during his senior season and ended up dying. And that was just a crush to the team. So the way the story goes is that during one of these hospital visits, Newt Rockne went in to see the Gipper in his hospital room, and they tell stories of like that people were like all the students were having a vigil outside the hospital to pray for Gipp to recover. And so Rockne goes in and says, is there what can I do? And the Gipp's like, oh, I think this is the end. This is the end. Rockne says, well, tell me what can I do for you? And Gipper says, like, when there's a time when your team really needs it, when your team is down and their backs are against the wall and they need some support, you need to tell them, and you need to tell them, and you need to mean it. Like, you need to tell them they need to go win one for the Gipper. And so Rockne had this story, and then as the book notes and as the video that we watched in class notes, you know, 10 years later in 1928, when they're playing Army, and they're vast underdogs, they've lost a couple games, you know, in the pregame, Newt Rockne recounts this story about Gipper, and there's this famous speech, win one for the Gipper, you know, from the movie. Ronald Reagan gives the speech, or not, Reagan doesn't give the speech, he plays the Gipper. But he's in the movie, and it's like this famous speech. And so we watched it in class, and you can see it in the recording for class. So I'm talking about it, but Rockne, but the Gipper was, so you have this cult of the fallen athlete. And so the Gipper was not this pure Catholic ideal person. In fact, you know, he was noted as being quite the opposite in gambling and drinking and womanizing and all of these things. And he's not the best person around. But what happened around his death is you have this memorialization and pulling only the positive aspects and really embellishing the legend of the Gipper. And the moral failures kind of fall by the wayside because this young athlete died before his time. And so really kind of elevated this. And even the movie, you know, the way Ron Reagan played him in the movie was that like this incredibly moral, passionate, handsome guy who the narrative says, you know, who could be president one day. And well, Ron Reagan was president, but that's not how he was in real life. So Rockne with the same thing. And so Rockne was killed in a plane crash. It was in 1928 or 1929. I forget the year. It doesn't say. So where does it say? Yeah, it was after the 1920s. I think it was the following season. So so he's going off. He was being promoted there, this incredible coach, and so he was trying to kind of expand his brand, and he was offered a position or a role in a film, and he was going around kind of like marketing his own brand. And the president of the university was not happy about this. But when he died, he was actually on his way out to negotiate a contract for a film, you know, where he plays a college coach. So, but he as well, and with some of his failings, both of them had to be scrubbed clean to have this image represent the legacy of the school. And so both Rockne and Gipp were seen as promoting the manly values to the all-male school in lieu of a culture that was becoming more feminine. So these two, I mean, they became, I mean, both dying in their prime, became icons and part of this cult of the fallen athlete. And it captured the national attention for Notre Dame. And so in the 1920s, you know, up until the 1930s, Notre Dame became this unifying university across, you know, with Catholics all around. And that lasted a generation and another generation. And then you get to a point where Notre Dame, you know, because of this, Notre Dame is able to sign their marketing deals where they don't have to be part of any conference. They're in the ACC this year, but their football team and their other sports besides their football team are in the ACC. But their football team has not been in a conference, and they're able to drive that market because they have such a national audience. And it comes from tracing all the way back to the early 1900s, 1918, 1920, when they were able to do this with Rockne, being able to establish this winning culture, but also with the Gipper, the unifying aspect of the KKK attacking the school and attacking students, the way that Newt Rockne positioned the former sports editors. I mean, he didn't position; they got hired on their own, but he kept up these connections with these sports editors across the country and gave them exclusive access to Notre Dame if they were writing stories about the university. All of these things had an incredible impact in nationalizing the brand of Notre Dame football. And it's really where you have this whole combination of the conflation of religion and sports at its primest example. So with that, it's fascinating. Hopefully you learn something from this. You can share some stories maybe with some family members around Notre Dame football over the weekend. But with that, I will conclude. And if you have any questions, please be sure to let me know. All the best.